At around 8 p.m. on December 16th, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nestor was very stressed out on this ride. All he wanted to do was get home because he was worried that on this ride, he might get pulled over by police. I mean, this was a route he had driven a bunch, and he knew there were loads of state troopers that patrolled the area. And from his perspective, it seemed like they kind of pulled people over all the time. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had had a couple of drinks. He didn't feel he had had too much to where he couldn't drive, but he knew if he did get pulled over, he could be in trouble. And then on top of that, in the back of Nestor's mind was the fact that he had had a couple of minor run-ins with the law over the past couple of years. And so he kind of had this fear of police already. And also, Nestor was not born in America. And so he was worried that on top of all that, if he got pulled over, he could risk being deported. And so on whole, Nestor just does not want to see any police officer. He just wants to get home and go to bed. And so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself and is trying to follow all the rules of the road, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And his Diet Coke was right in the middle console, and so as he's driving eyes straight ahead, he reaches down and he grabs the Coke, he pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip, but then as he puts the drink back down, again, he's keeping his eyes on the road, he hits something with the drink, and he feels the drink slosh out of his cup and it hits his hand, and instinctively, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder, and then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road. He was too close to swerve out of the way, and so at full speed, he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and basically caves in the passenger side windshield and flips up and over the back of his car. And Nestor, amazingly, was composed enough to not swerve wildly post-impact, because he knew if he did that, he could run into oncoming traffic or something. And so he just kept on going straight and gradually slowed down and pulled off the side of the road. And as he did, he looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, or even worse, maybe it hit some other car. But when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Now, even though Nestor was obviously very shaken up at this point, he just had this horrible car accident with this deer, and he's already on edge about getting pulled over by police. But for the moment, it was just peaceful on the highway. No cops were coming up to him, and he's pulled over to the side. Physically he was okay. It seemed like the deer was okay. It clearly ran off the road or something. And there was damage to his car. The deer really smashed in the front of his car, and the windshield, especially on the passenger side, was basically caved in. But Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. And so even though Nestor felt kind of bad that he had smashed this deer, he thought, what am I going to do? Go find the deer and make sure it's okay? He can't really do anything. It's nighttime. So he made the decision that, nobody saw this and it seems like everything's okay, so I'm just going to drive home and I'll take care of my car tomorrow. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. And so Nestor knew, this is so conspicuous, he's gonna get pulled over if he doesn't stop. And so feeling really annoyed, because he was actually pretty close to home at this point, Nestor pulled off the highway and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. And so at first, all Nestor did was just turn off his car and wait for a couple of minutes in hopes that, that would be enough to cure his car. But after a couple of minutes, the smoke continued to billow out of his car, and then when he tried to turn it back on again, the car simply wouldn't start. And so at this point, Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck. But when he reached for his phone was dead. And he didn't have a phone charger in his car, and so he's like, great, I can't even call a tow truck. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there, and he would ask one of them if they had a charger. So Nestor gets out of his smoking car, he walks into the restaurant, he goes up to the counter, and he asks the person behind the counter, hey, my phone's dead, do you have a charger? Do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor, no, they don't have a charger. And then they just stood there, still staring at Nestor. And so now Nestor is genuinely just furious. The whole night has completely derailed here. All he wanted to do was get home, and it's one horrible thing happens after another. And so Nestor was just okay, fine. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And so Nestor gets back into his car, he climbs into the driver's seat, he shuts the door, and as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. And actually, he eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. So Nestor groggily turned and looked, and it was like the worst case scenario. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle, clearly gesturing for Nestor to roll his window down. And so Nestor was totally compliant. He rolled the window down, and he looked at the officer, and before Nestor could even say anything, the officer said, "Get out of the car." He's thinking to himself, why is he acting so aggressively towards me? Like, what have I done here? And so Nestor, he gets out of the car, and again, before Nestor can ask any questions, the officer just says to Nestor, "What happened tonight? Like, what's going on here?" And so Nestor, he knows his car is jacked up, and here he is sleeping in the parking lot, and so he turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. He was driving down the road, he hits this deer, it went over the top, he didn't see it, he didn't report it, and as he's telling the officer this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, like, is there a law? Like, if you hit a deer, are you supposed to report it? Is that what's going on? Maybe the deer did die, and it was in the middle of the road, and somebody saw his license plate, and now the cop was here. And so Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer, and how sorry he was, he should have stopped, he should have called the police, but the officer finally just put up his hand, telling Nestor to stop talking, and then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. And when the officer did that, the officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor's like, what is going on here? Like, this whole night has been such a disaster. Like, what did I do? And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car that would elicit such a big response from him. And when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, where the cop's light was now shining, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he had only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk and should never have been behind the wheel. And when he was driving on the highway, anxiously trying to get home, well, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat, minus one leg, which had been severed on impact. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. He thinks there's a deer back there, but there was never a deer. There's just a dead guy next to him. And Nestor just drove 40 more miles with Terry's dead body next to him. And then when Nestor's car began to smoke and make noises, he pulled off the highway to that fast food restaurant parking lot. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor and could basically not even speak when Nestor was trying to talk to them was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood, Terry's blood. Now, it's not entirely clear why that employee did not immediately call police. But, after Nestor left the restaurant, went back to his car, and fell asleep, during the time Nestor was sleeping, someone inside the restaurant did call the police, and that's why they showed up and knocked on Nestor's glass. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated. Our next story is called Ancient Beast. On August 25th, 2010, a small twin-engine propeller plane sat on the tarmac at Kinshasa International Airport in the Congo. As the plane was being refueled, the co-pilots, 62-year-old Danny Philemont from Belgium and 39-year-old Chris Wilson from England, walked up the stairs and into the cockpit. As the pilots got settled in and began their internal systems checks, the flight attendant walked up the stairs, she said hello to the pilots, and then she began preparing the cabin for the passengers. The main cabin began boarding at 11 a.m., and by 11:30 a.m., all 18 passengers that were expected to board had taken their seats. So the flight attendant closed the doors, went into the cockpit, and told the pilots they were ready for takeoff. This was going to be a 1-hour-long routine domestic flight to Bandundu, which is a province that was just outside the border of Kinshasa to the east. This particular crew had made this flight dozens of times in the past without any issues. As the little plane made its way over to the runway, the flight attendant demonstrated what to do in case of various in-flight emergencies, and then by noon, the plane was airborne. 1 hour later, residents of a town located just southwest of Bandundu remembered looking up into the sky and seeing the small prop plane falling through the clouds in a near vertical nosedive. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the ground right in the middle of the neighborhood. Luckily, the crash did not kill anybody on the ground, but unfortunately, the pilots, the flight attendant, and 17 of the 18 passengers died on impact. And the one passenger that survived was very badly hurt and was left in a coma. An investigation was launched into what happened, and very quickly it was theorized that they must have run out of gas, because when they hit the ground there was no explosion, there was no fire, but upon closer inspection it would turn out the plane had plenty of fuel. The black box, which is a device that records the audio inside the cockpit, was recovered, but unfortunately it was inoperable, so it didn't give them any other clues as to what happened. Investigators were stumped. Did they strike a bird in the air? Did the engines suddenly fail? Was it operator error? They didn't know. A few days after the crash, the one surviving passenger miraculously came out of their coma and remembered in vivid detail what happened up in the skies right before they crashed. They said as the plane was making their final descent into Bandundu, the flight attendant was walking down the aisle reminding everyone to put away their big devices and put their seat in the upright position, and as she got about halfway down the aisle, she looked towards the back of the plane and she suddenly gasped and covered her mouth, turned around and walked very quickly back towards the front of the plane into the cockpit where she disappeared. The passengers that had seen her do this were immediately concerned that something was wrong with the plane, and so they stood up and looked towards the rear of the plane where she had been looking, and right away they knew what it was she was concerned about. There was a hissing crocodile making its way up the aisle. Someone must have smuggled it on. And as passengers realized what was happening, they all panicked and stampeded towards the front of the plane. This sudden shift in weight threw off the plane's center of gravity, causing a nosedive that the pilots could not recover from before they crashed. After hearing this story, the investigators remembered that a living crocodile had been found around the wreckage, but no one had thought much of it because in the Congo, lots of exotic animals are smuggled onto flights. Specifically, crocodiles are smuggled onto these planes with such regularity that passengers often can recognize the very specific crocodile smell somewhere in the cabin. And they'll tell the pilots, they'll come back, they'll find the crocodile and the owner of said crocodile, they'll kick them off before takeoff. But obviously this time, nobody smelled the crocodile. The third and final story of today's episode is called Stay Forgetful. On the afternoon of July 13th, 1994, a man woke up feeling very confused and disoriented, and he felt some pain in the back of his head. And as he opened his eyes, he kind of slowly realized that he was on his back in a ditch on the side of the road, looking up at a big blue sky. The man tried to sit up, but as soon as he did, he felt this throbbing pain in the back of his head, and he reached back to touch it, but the second he did, it hurt even worse, and he definitely felt there was a pretty big lump on the back of his head. And then when he brought his hands in front of his face, he saw he had all these bruises around his wrists that he had no idea what they were from. And so as this man in the ditch is trying to figure out what's going on, suddenly this older man who he didn't know just appeared by the side of the road and looked down and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And so the guy in the ditch is looking at this guy. He's got no idea who he is. And he wants to say, what's going on? Where am I? Who am I? What's happening? But he couldn't find the words. It's like he just kept looking at this older guy, looking at his wrist and feeling his head and having no idea what's going on. But then for some reason, 3 names popped into this guy's head, the guy in the ditch. He thought of 3 names. He had no idea whose names these were, but for some reason, he felt like those names were really important. And so after a few minutes of awkward silence, as the guy in the ditch is trying to talk, he finally just blurts out these 3 names. He says, Pat, Joel, Chris. And so the older man who had asked the guy in the ditch what was going on, he didn't really know how to react to this guy blurting out these names. And so he kind of ignored it and just said, okay, hi, my name's Steve. And then Steve, the older man, helped the guy from the ditch out of the ditch. And then once the man in the ditch was on his feet, kind of looking around, he looked at Steve and suddenly he could say other words. And he said to Steve, where are we? And Steve looked at him and said, we're in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Now, the guy in the ditch didn't know why, but he immediately felt like Wyoming had to be wrong. Like, there's no way he could be in Wyoming. But the guy in the ditch didn't know where he was supposed to be. He didn't know who Steve was. He didn't know who Pat, Joel, or Chris was. And so it's all totally confusing. And so he just stood there kind of saying nothing. And as he did, Steve said, "Hold on a minute, I'm going to get my stuff." And so Steve kind of shuffled down the road like 10, 20 feet away, where there was a shopping cart full of cans, and there was a backpack and some other things dangling off the side. And as Steve grabbed the shopping cart, turned it around, and slowly began pushing it back towards the guy in the ditch stared at Steve and kind of put together that, Steve must be homeless. And this realization made the guy in the ditch think that, maybe he was homeless too. And so suddenly, instinctively, the guy from the ditch began reaching into his pockets, thinking maybe he had an ID or something that would show him who he was, that would show he was not homeless, that he had a place that he needed to go to. And he reached in his pockets, but there was nothing. All he found was 23 cents and a comb. And so by the time Steve came over with his cart and asked the guy from the ditch, "Hey, do you want to come to the shelter with me?" The guy from the ditch was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll go with you." And then once the guy from the ditch and Steve arrived at the shelter, when they went inside, the guy from the ditch had to introduce himself to the people who ran the shelter. And so he made up a name combining one of those names that was running through his head, Pat, with the color of the desk of the person who was asking him for his name inside of the shelter. And so he just called himself Pat Brown. And after Pat Brown got a room inside of the shelter, he went to bed that night, still having no idea what was going on, but he felt confident, if I just sleep tonight, I'll wake up tomorrow and I'll know what's going on. I'll figure out, what happened to me. But the next day when Pat woke up, he was still completely confused, did not know who he was, had no idea what was going on, but he had the wherewithal to know that, something bad must have happened to him. And maybe he should go talk to the police because maybe they would know if other people were looking for him or something. And so Pat walked from the shelter to the police station. It was not far away. And he went inside and very politely, he walked up to the desk. He introduced himself to the cop who was on duty. And Pat just began explaining to the cop as much as he could remember. He said, yesterday I woke up in a ditch. I don't know who I am. I don't know why I'm here. I think I have amnesia. I just keep thinking of 3 names in my head, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but I have no idea what they mean. Can you help me? Now, the cop who's hearing this did not think, "Oh my goodness, this is totally legitimate. Let's launch an investigation to figure out who you are." Instead, the cop is like, "Is this guy on drugs? Is he mentally ill? What's going on with this guy?" But the cop would say, Pat was incredibly polite and did not appear to be intoxicated. And so the cop humored him and said, "Okay, you know what? Let's look through the most recent missing person reports in the area to see if somebody matching your description, is a missing person." And so the cop began going through the database, but he couldn't find anybody that matched Pat's description. And so at some point he said, "Look, I can't really help you very much here because you're a grown man. You do not seem to be in distress here. And even though it's very unfortunate that you can't remember who you are or where you need to go or, where your family is, that's not really a police matter." But as he was saying this to Pat, who's kind of crestfallen, he's putting his hands near his face and just kind of reacting to this news that the police are not going to help him. And the police officer says, "Hold on a minute, look at your hand." And so Pat looked at his hand and he saw, there was no ring on his left ring finger, but there was a pretty obvious callus where a ring should have been. It looked like, Pat must have been wearing a ring up until recently, and for some reason it was now off. And so the cop said, "Hey, it looks like you may be married or were married for a long time because you got that callus. But, beyond that, I'm sorry, there's not much else I can offer you." And so even though this was somewhat valuable information, it didn't really point Pat in any direction. And so he was about to turn and leave when the cop said, "Hey, do you want to ride to the hospital? Because it seems like you could be having some sort of medical event here." But Pat politely declined and just told the officer to please be in touch with him if anybody came calling looking for somebody that kind of seemed like him. And the police officer said he would. And so after this, Pat left the station and went back to the shelter and basically told himself, "I'm going to stay here and just wait until my memory comes back." Because at this point, that was kind of all he could do. However, weeks would go by at the shelter and nobody would contact the police looking for somebody like Pat Brown, and Pat wouldn't remember any more details. The only thing that kept coming into his head was those 3 names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but that was it. And so finally, after a few weeks of no progress being made, Pat decided he would leave the shelter in Cheyenne and go to Jackson, Wyoming, because some other people in the shelter had talked about Jackson, Wyoming as being a place where people who don't have ID cards could get jobs and basically start over. And because Jackson was only a little over 400 miles away from Cheyenne, it was not unreasonable to try to hitchhike your way to Jackson. And so almost exactly 2 months from the day Pat woke up inside of this ditch, he began hitchhiking his way towards Jackson. When Pat got to Jackson, he was able to get a job without an ID. He got a job at a newspaper sorting mail and doing some clerical work, and at first he stayed in a shelter like he had in Cheyenne until he had saved up enough money to rent a room. And as the months went by in Jackson, Pat did begin to remember additional details about what seemed like his former life. He discovered while doing clerical work at the newspaper that he was able to use an adding machine without looking at it. It was like his fingers just knew where to go. He also discovered that he was able to do really complex math problems in his head. And then also, in virtue of being at the newspaper, he saw a lot of information about the stock market, and he actually seemed to know a lot about the stock market, even though he didn't know why. Also, while Pat was in Jackson, he started to feel this really intense compulsion to go to a Catholic church. And so he began going to Catholic Mass, and while he was in church, he just automatically began saying the prayers along with everybody else, even though, again, he didn't really know why he had that information in his head. But the biggest clue that came back to Pat while he was in Jackson was this recurring dream he would have where he was at this campground somewhere and this little boy comes around the corner and looks up at Pat and says, "Hey Dad, Mom needs your help with Chris." And then in the dream, he responds to this child by saying, "Okay, Joel, I'll be right there." And so with all these clues kind of coming back into focus, Pat sort of felt like he had a grip on who he used to be. Based on the callus on his finger and on that recurring dream, it did seem like he was a married man who had at least 2 kids, Joel and Chris, and so his wife was very likely named Pat, or maybe Pat was another child he didn't know. And then also he felt like he must have been maybe an accountant or somebody who worked with numbers, based on the adding machine and understanding the stock market and complex math problems. And also he was a devout Catholic, because that's the only way he would know all those prayers. But despite kind of putting together who he seemed to be in his previous life, that didn't really tell him anything about what he should do now. Like, he didn't know where his potential family was, or where his job was, or where he should go. And so even though he had this kind of former life formed in his mind, he couldn't act on it. And so Pat's weird life in limbo in Jackson, Wyoming, just kind of continued to drag on. And so by the end of 1997, so by this point, it's been 3.5 years since Pat has woken up in this ditch confused. He's still in Jackson, Wyoming. He still has no idea who he is. And it's starting to set in that unless he takes drastic measures here, he'll never figure out the truth about who he is. And so early in 1998, Pat does take drastic measure. He contacts a very popular TV show at the time called Unsolved Mysteries and asks them to please cover his story, because if they did, it would be broadcast across the country and maybe somebody out there would recognize him and come find him. And sure enough, when Pat contacted Unsolved Mysteries, they thought his story was totally insane and they covered it. Pat's episode aired on April 10th, 1998, almost exactly 4 years after Pat woke up in that ditch. And on the day his episode aired, in a city in Indiana, 1,500 miles away from Jackson, Wyoming, a phone rang in a woman's house. And so she answered it, and it was her cousin, and her cousin told her, "Stop whatever you're doing and turn on the TV, put it on channel CBS." And so this woman, she walks into the living room, she turns on the TV, flips it to CBS, and she sees an episode of Unsolved Mysteries is playing, and it's Pat Brown's episode. And this woman is staring at the TV, and she practically faints when she sees what it's about. But she stays composed and just stands there staring at the TV, so shocked she can't even say anything. And the whole time her cousin is yelling through the phone, saying, "Can you believe it? Oh my goodness." And then at some point on the TV, a phone number flashed at the bottom of the screen where the producers of the show told the audience, "Hey, if you know anything about this case, call this number." And so at this, the woman who's watching the TV, she hangs up on her cousin and she dials that number she sees on the TV. Pat's drastic decision to call Unsolved Mysteries would indeed solve the mystery of who he was. However, the truth about who Pat was is not what you think. It would turn out some of the clues that Pat had sort of naturally recalled in those 4 years that he was kind of figuring out who he was were indeed clues of his former life. He really was a married father. Those 3 names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, those were the names of his wife and his 2 sons. Pat was his wife, and Joel and Chris were his 2 sons. And he really was a devout Catholic, which is why he was able to remember all of those prayers. But some of the other clues he thought of over those 4 years, like his incredible aptitude for math, or the fact that he could use an adding machine without looking, or the fact that he understood the stock market so easily, those were clues about his former life, but specifically, they were clues about why Pat was in this position in the first place. It would turn out Pat Brown was actually a man named Carl Brodnick Jr. And Carl Brodnick Jr. was a wanted felon who had misappropriated tens of thousands of dollars from the advertising agency where he worked as an accountant. And Carl had been under serious criminal investigation when he suddenly disappeared from his home in Indiana on July 8, 1994, which is 5 days before Pat Brown woke up in that ditch on the side of the road with a lump on his head, markings on his wrist, and having no idea who he was or what happened to him. Now, there has never been a perfect explanation for what actually happened to Carl, but if you think about this logically, his claim of having amnesia is very likely true. Why would a guy use amnesia as his cover story to flee the law, run to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and say, I don't know who I am, I don't know what happened to me, only to then, a few years later, go on national TV and out himself and totally make himself a target for the police? It doesn't make any sense. And then also adding credibility to this idea that maybe something happened to Carl versus Carl running off to save himself is we know that when Carl disappeared on July 8th, 1994 from his home in Indiana, he took out $1,000 in cash from his checking account and then also took out another large sum of cash from his home's second mortgage. However, when he woke up in that ditch, all the money was gone. He just had 23 cents in his pocket. Now, after Carl vanished from his house in Indiana, police did go looking for him because he was under criminal investigation, so they wanted to find him, and they pretty quickly found his car 250 miles away from his home in a strip mall parking lot in Missouri, but there was no sign of Carl anywhere. And then right after the police found his car, they checked Carl's credit card, and they discovered it had just been used in Colorado, so 900 miles away, to buy clothes. But when they went to that store and tried to find security footage of, when that transaction took place, there was no footage. And so there was no way of knowing if Carl really was the guy in Colorado making that transaction or if somebody else had his credit card. And then after that, there were no other leads. Nobody had any idea what happened to Carl. His family didn't know, the police had nothing to go on, and so very quickly his case went cold. Until 4 years later, when that episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired. Now, there are many theories about what could have happened to Carl, but the leading theory, that again is just a theory, is that Carl may have been in debt to some very dangerous people. And so when he fled his home in Indiana, it's very likely that he was not running from the law, even though he was under criminal investigation. He was actually running from these dangerous people. And that the reason he might have been stealing from his company was to pay off these dangerous people, but apparently it wasn't enough. Hence why he decided to just kind of take off and run away. And these dangerous people seemed to have caught up to him, and they captured him, and it looked like they tied his wrists at some point because of the marks on his wrist, and they very likely tortured him or something, hence why he had this very serious head injury, and then it seems like they dumped him on the side of the road, very likely to die. They might have thought he was dead already, but he didn't die, and when he came to, he must have really had amnesia from the injuries he sustained from these bad people that chased him down. But again, that's just a theory. When Carl's episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired, it was his wife, Pat Brodnick, who was the one who saw him on TV and couldn't believe it and called it in. And then when she called this in, at first, Pat was reunited with his family, and it was this big happy reunion. Pat comes back home, he sees his wife and his kids, and then he's immediately arrested and prosecuted for embezzlement. Now, ultimately, Carl would plead guilty to the charges against him, but he would say the whole time, I don't remember committing this crime. I don't remember anything. And so ultimately, Carl did not get sent to prison. He instead served time on probation, and then after it was over, he just went back to living as Carl Brodnick Jr., despite still having huge gaps in his memory, at least according to Carl.
On a hot July afternoon in 2011, 43-year-old Roberto Ayala drove his white Ford F-250 truck down a private farm road past a field of sunflowers in full bloom. Roberto had worked that farmland outside of the small town of Colusa, California, since he was a young man. But looking out at that sea of yellow flowers in the sunlight still took his breath away. Roberto glanced over at the passenger seat and saw his 7-year-old son, Fabian, staring out the window, also transfixed by the flowers. Roberto smiled. He wanted all 3 of his kids to appreciate the beauty of nature as much as he did. The sunflower field was part of 1,800 acres of farmland owned by the Moore brothers, 2 wealthy and powerful men in their 70s. Roberto had started working for the Moore brothers decades earlier as a farmhand, and the brothers had taken to Roberto almost immediately. They thought Roberto was a natural farmer who understood the land even better than they did. And so the Moore brothers had quickly come to trust and rely on Roberto. They had looked to him to weigh in on major decisions about their farmland, like what to plant and when to plant it. And within a short period of time, Roberto had gained more responsibility within the Moore brothers' family business, and eventually they made Roberto their farm manager. Managing the Moore brothers' multi-million-dollar farm was a stressful job, but Roberto loved it. And he looked up to the Moore brothers like father figures who had given him a chance to succeed and who trusted him like he was part of their own family. In his truck, Roberto eased off the gas, pulled to the side of the road, and parked. He told his son Fabian to wait in the truck while he went out and did a couple of chores. Roberto's job, managing the Moore brothers' farmland, often required him to be on call 7 days a week, from sunup to sundown. So Roberto often took one of his 3 kids with him when he had to check on something at the farm. It gave Roberto a chance to spend some time with his kids, and he had already started to train his older son in aspects of farm management, in the hope his son would take over for him someday. But when Roberto was with his 7-year-old Fabian, he didn't pressure the boy to learn anything about farming unless Fabian asked. Roberto just liked sitting in his truck talking with Fabian in both English and Spanish, and giving him a chance to take in the beautiful Northern California scenery. Roberto grabbed a pair of rubber electrical gloves sitting between him and Fabian, and then he hopped out of the truck into the summer sun. Roberto was not a big guy, but he was very strong. He wore jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat, and he had salt and pepper hair and a thick, dark mustache. He took off his cowboy hat and wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. Then he put his hat back on and walked away from the truck down the road a few feet towards a tall wooden pole that had a high-voltage electrical box on it about the size of a high school locker. Roberto slipped on his electrical gloves and opened the box. This large metal box was one of many on the Moore brothers' farmland that housed electrical switches that controlled irrigation pumps used to water the fields of different crops at different times. Roberto turned on the irrigation pump, closed the metal box, pulled off his gloves, and began walking back towards his truck. But he stopped on the side of the road when he saw another truck driving towards him. The truck stopped a few feet away from Roberto's truck, and Paul Moore, the son of one of the 2 Moore brothers, stepped out. Paul was 47 years old, he was 6 feet tall, good-looking, and he had brown hair and green eyes. Paul waved to Roberto's son, Fabian, who was still sitting in his dad's truck, and then Paul trotted his way over to Roberto. Roberto had worked alongside Paul for almost 20 years. When they were younger, they had both worked in the fields together, but now as Paul got older, he had moved more into helping run the business side of the family farm. Paul and Roberto got along well, and they regularly checked in with each other, and it was assumed by almost everyone in the company that when the older Moore brothers retired, Paul and Roberto would essentially run the farm together. Paul and Roberto asked each other how their families were doing, and then they shifted gears and began talking a bit about the current sunflower and rice crops growing on the farmland. But then Paul got a strange look on his face, like he was embarrassed by what he was about to say. Roberto asked him what was wrong, and Paul said it was about his cousin, Peter. Roberto smiled and kind of shook his head. It was rarely good news when Peter came up. Peter Moore was a couple years younger than his cousin Paul, and the 2 had basically been raised as brothers. Their fathers had run the family farming business together for decades, and they had always intended to pass the land and the business onto their sons, who they hoped would run things together just like they had. But Peter had just never seemed ready to take on any real responsibility. When he was young, he had worked in the fields alongside Paul and Roberto, but he always seemed angry about one aspect of the job or another. And over the years, he had gained the reputation of having a bad temper and he spent a lot of his time complaining about the way he felt mistreated by his father and his uncle. And over the years, Peter had also made a habit of blaming a lot of his problems on Roberto. He said Roberto was arrogant and bad at his job, and that he didn't deserve the respect he got from the Moore brothers. On the side of the road, Roberto asked Paul what Peter had done. Paul took a breath and told him that Peter was looking for a fight with Roberto, like a real physical confrontation. Roberto laughed. That sounded like something a kid would say. But Paul told Roberto he was being serious. Peter had spent years taking martial arts classes, and now he wanted to literally fight Roberto. Roberto laughed again. He thanked Paul for the heads up, but he said there was no way he was going to physically fight Peter or anyone else for that matter. Then Roberto and Paul shook hands, said they'd talk soon, and walked back to their trucks. Once he was back in his truck, Roberto asked his son, Fabian, if he'd had a good time coming to work with him. And Fabian said he had, and that he wanted to come to work with his dad more often. Roberto said, "Great, it's a deal," and then he hit the gas, drove down the road, and left the field of yellow sunflowers behind them. That night, Roberto, his wife, and 3 children sat around the dinner table talking. And Roberto laughed all over again when he told his family about how Peter wanted to fight him. Fabian and his big brother laughed along with their dad, but Roberto's wife and daughter were not amused. Roberto's daughter didn't like Peter at all, and she didn't trust him. She had gone to work with her dad a lot over the years, and she was old enough to understand that Peter did have it out for her dad. In fact, Peter didn't even hide his disdain for Roberto, and she had heard Peter say mean things about her father right in front of her. But Roberto told his daughter and his wife that there was nothing to worry about. Peter was all talk, and he would never have the guts to actually try to fight him. But later that night, as Roberto's wife lay in bed next to him, she was still worried. As far as she was concerned, Peter was an angry, rich man who acted like the world owed him something. And she feared Peter would follow through with his latest threat, no matter how foolish Roberto thought it sounded. A couple of weeks later, on July 16th, 2011, Roberto was back in his white Ford F-250 with his 7-year-old son, Fabian, at his side in the passenger seat. Roberto was in his usual work clothes, jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat, and Fabian wore a cowboy hat too, exactly like his dad's. At about 1 p.m., Roberto drove past the sunflower fields, and a few minutes later, he glanced out his window towards one of the Moore brothers' rice fields. He pulled the truck over and parked on the side of the road. Roberto told his son to wait in the truck, and then he grabbed his electrical gloves, and he hopped out and walked towards a large metal high-voltage box on a wooden pole like he had done a couple weeks earlier. It was time for Roberto to irrigate this rice field. As his dad walked off, Fabian stayed in the truck as he was told, staring back at the sunflower fields in the distance. The young boy already shared his dad's appreciation for the beautiful flower. Then suddenly, Fabian felt the ground begin to shake, and the windshield glass shattered. Without thinking, Fabian threw his hands up in front of his face, and he felt shards of glass stinging his arms. Fabian screamed and looked around, totally confused. Growing up in Northern California, Fabian was already familiar with earthquakes, and for a second, he thought that's what this must have been. But then, Fabian stepped out of the truck, and he felt an intense heat on his face. He stumbled towards where his dad had walked off to, and when he looked out towards the rice fields, he began screaming and crying. He called out to his dad, but his dad didn't respond. Fabian looked up and down the isolated farm road, but there was nobody in sight, so the 7-year-old boy just turned around and began running back down the road towards the sunflower field. Fabian ran as fast as he could, and as he did, his cowboy hat fell off the back of his head, but Fabian didn't even stop to pick it up. He just kept on running. Several minutes later, Fabian reached the sunflower field. He'd gone to work with his dad enough to know there was a small neighborhood on the other side of this field, so he rushed into the tall stalks of the flowers and ran through the field as fast and as hard as he could. But as Fabian ran, he felt his feet sinking into the mud that recent irrigation had caused. Fabian stopped, bent down, and pulled off his shoes and socks. Then he just kept on running through the field barefoot, holding his shoes in his hands. As he ran, tears streamed down his face, mud covered his feet, and his legs felt like they were on fire, but Fabian did not stop. Finally, after running 2 miles barefoot in the hot summer sun, the 7-year-old boy burst out of the field into a clearing. He looked up and he saw a few small houses on the other side of the clearing, so despite being totally out of breath, he forced himself to just keep on running. When he reached the other side, Fabian stumbled up the walkway to the first house he came to, and he knocked on the door and screamed at the top of his lungs. Seconds later, the door flew open, and a woman saw the little boy standing there yelling and covered in mud. The woman rushed out of her house, wrapped her arms around the boy, and pulled him inside. She asked him what was going on, and Fabian coughed and wheezed, and he looked up at the woman and he told her he had come from the rice field with his dad, and his dad was on fire. The woman grabbed her phone and immediately dialed 911. A few minutes after the woman called 911, Detective Dave Salm of the Colusa County Sheriff's Department stepped out of the small sheriff's station and walked across the lot to his car. Along with this 911 call, the sheriff's department had gotten multiple calls from people all over the place saying they had heard a loud explosion coming from the Moore brothers' farm. Detective Salm got into his car and headed out towards the farm road near the rice field where Roberto and Fabian had been. Calls like this were not a regular thing in Colusa County, but they weren't too out of the ordinary either. As a sheriff's detective, Salm spent a good amount of his time investigating potential industrial accidents in the area. Farming was dangerous business, and unfortunately, Salm had witnessed his share of serious injuries and deaths related to faulty farm equipment and just plain bad luck. Thick black smoke hung in the air as Salm pulled onto the farm road that led to the rice field. He hit the gas and sped toward the road, and soon he could see the swirling lights of the fire trucks up ahead. And as he got closer, the heat from a burning fire hit him even inside of his car. Salm pulled over to the side of the road far enough away from the scene that he wouldn't interfere with the fire department who was trying to put out the fire. And after several minutes, the fire department got the blaze that had engulfed part of the rice field under control. By that time, a few other officers from the sheriff's department had arrived, so Salm led his small investigative team down the road to where the fire had been put out. He walked past Roberto's white truck, and he saw shattered glass from the windshield and windows scattered over 10 feet on the ground. Then he walked closer to the rice field, and he saw the splintered fragments of what used to be a tall wooden pole. The large metal box that had once been attached to this pole was nowhere to be found. Just then, a member of the fire department approached Salm. The two men had worked together several times before. The firefighter led Salm and his team past pieces of metal on the ground and around behind one of the fire trucks. When they got back there, Salm could still see the smoke in the air and he could feel it in his lungs, and he covered his mouth and his nose and then looked down at the ground. And when he did, he shuddered. Because he was staring at the burnt remains of a person. It was the charred body of Roberto Ayala. Detective Salm tried to catch his breath, but the smoke and the shock of the sight of Roberto made it very hard to breathe. Salm had investigated plenty of industrial accidents, but he'd never seen anything even close to this. Salm knelt down to get a better look at Roberto, and it was obvious he'd been badly burned for an extended period of time. But Roberto's cowboy boots looked like they'd almost remained untouched. So Salm got down as low as he could and craned his neck to get a good look at the bottom of Roberto's boots. And he saw there were several burn holes, each an inch wide on the sole of the boots. Salm called over members of the fire department. He thought he knew what those burn holes meant, but he wanted a second opinion. So a few of the firefighters crouched down next to Salm, and they looked at Roberto's boots as well, and all of them agreed the holes on the bottom were a clear sign of electrocution. Even though the wooden pole had been obliterated, Salm knew there had been a high-voltage unit attached to it at some point. So he sent members of his team to go look for parts of this locker-sized metal box that would have housed the electrical switch that controlled the irrigation pumps. And while the team fanned out to look for remnants of the box, Salm and members of the fire department talked through what they thought they were seeing. They had all encountered electrocution in industrial accidents, but this scene just seemed different than anything any of them had dealt with before. There was so much damage to the wooden pole, to the rice field, and even to Roberto's truck that this looked like a far bigger thing than just a malfunction within the high-voltage box. Detective Salm prided himself on his work ethic and his commitment to his community, but he never pretended to be some kind of Sherlock Holmes who could figure everything out. And he was more than willing to admit that he had no idea what had happened to Roberto and that he badly needed help investigating this. And so Salm grabbed his phone and reached out to Pacific Gas and Electric, the utility company that provided natural gas and electricity services to millions of Californians. And later that day, that company sent crewmen out to the scene, but when they arrived, they felt as lost as Detective Salm was. They told him they had never seen a blast radius on that scale in any kind of incident involving a high-voltage unit like the one Roberto would have been using. Then, members of Salm's team returned to the scene with the door of the high-voltage box that was on that pole, and they said they had found it over 150 feet away from where it had first been on the pole. And when Salm and members of the fire department heard how far that door had flown from this explosion, they admitted that they really didn't know if the explosion had been an accident or if maybe it had been caused by a bomb on purpose. On July 17th, so the day following the deadly explosion, Detective Salm drove back out to the farm road where Roberto had been killed. As Salm drove, he felt his eyelids getting heavy. He'd barely slept at all since arriving at the scene the day before, and he still didn't even know if he was dealing with an accident or a crime. But that was not what had kept him awake. The night before, Salm and members of his team had checked on Roberto's son, Fabian, at the hospital, where the boy had been brought after running 2 miles barefoot to get help for his father. Then the officers had driven Fabian home. Roberto's wife had gotten the initial call from police telling her that Fabian had been taken to the hospital. Roberto's wife spoke Spanish, and she usually had Roberto or one of the kids translate for her. But nobody else had been in the house when she had gotten the call, and so there had been communication issues between her and the police officer on the other line. That meant when police had arrived at the house with Fabian, his mother, Roberto's wife, still didn't know what had happened to her husband. And when Fabian had walked in, she ran and hugged him and then asked where his dad was. And Fabian, the 7-year-old, had to tell her that dad is dead. Everything about the scene at the house had been totally gut-wrenching. Roberto's family cried, while the 2 oldest kids translated the story of what had happened to their father to their mother. And all the while, they all tried to make sure Fabian was somehow okay after having just seen his father's body burning right in front of him and then needing to run 2 miles at a dead sprint to try to get help. In his car, Salm shook himself awake and focused on the road ahead of him. And after he'd driven a couple of miles, he saw up ahead a swarm of law enforcement vehicles blocking the road. Seeing the heartbreak of Roberto's family right up close and personal had made Salm really want to figure out what had happened to Roberto as quickly as possible, and that meant he first had to determine if Roberto's death was an accident or a murder. But by the end of the previous day, Salm and the others had still been at a total loss. So Salm had done the only thing he could think of. He contacted 2 federal agencies for help: the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF. The ATF was the agency that investigated federal crimes involving arson, explosives, and bombs. Salm parked his car on the farm road, stepped outside, and almost instantly regretted his decision to call the feds. The appearance of the FBI and ATF had surely already terrified residents in that small town near the Moore Brothers farm, and those agencies could completely overwhelm a county's resources while taking over from local law enforcement. Salm smiled and waved at the big group of feds out in front of him as he approached a particular ATF agent who was on the scene, but all Salm could think about was how he had possibly brought this circus to town for nothing more than maybe just an industrial accident. The ATF agent he approached introduced himself to Salm. The agent was tall and skinny, and he wore glasses, and Salm thought the guy seemed oddly excited for somebody who was in town to investigate a horrible death. But the ATF agent told Salm that they found evidence he needed to see. The agent led Salm down the road past several other members of the ATF and also the FBI, and then walked him over to a large piece of metal that was laid out on the ground. The agent said someone had found this piece of metal in a canal not far from the rice field and brought it to the agents because the person thought it might have something to do with the explosion that had occurred. And the agent said that that person was right. He crouched down and motioned for Salm to do the same, and then once they both were down there, the agent pointed to a series of markings on this piece of metal. Salm just stared at the agent and asked him what they were looking at. The agent said he would need to run a series of tests on the metal fragment to determine exactly what had happened, but the markings on the piece clearly indicated that some type of bomb had been detonated in the high-voltage box that housed the switch for the irrigation pump. In short, the agent said this had not been an accident at all. Somebody had definitely murdered Roberto Ayala. Detective Salm exhaled and his shoulders relaxed. He was horrified that somebody would want to kill Roberto, a man who was well-liked in the area, who was also a husband and a father. But this news at least let Salm know that he had been right to ask for help from the FBI and ATF because this was a crime. The ATF agent told Salm it would take some time for them to search the entire site and to run all the tests they needed to run, but Salm could definitely launch a murder investigation immediately. Salm thanked the agent, and then he headed back to the sheriff's station to regroup with his investigative team and to inform them they now had a very public murder case on their hands. But it didn't take long for investigators to get their first lead. That afternoon, Salm got a call from a guy who said he had to talk to him immediately. The man's name was Paul Moore, and he said he might know who killed Roberto. Later that day, Paul Moore, the heir to the Moore brothers farming business, stepped into the sheriff's station. Salm had been waiting for Paul to arrive, and so when he did, he went right over to him, shook his hand, and thanked him for coming in. Everybody in the sheriff's department knew Paul well from just living in the area, and they were used to seeing him laughing, telling stories, and pretty much just lighting up any room he walked into. But Salm could tell on this day, something was very wrong. Paul looked pale and worried, and when he greeted Salm, his voice was quiet and shaky. Salm, along with another detective, led Paul into a small office and closed the door behind them so they could talk privately. Paul took a seat at a small table, and the detective sat down across from him. Then Salm asked Paul what prompted him to reach out to police. Paul cleared his throat, and then in a quiet voice, he told them what had happened over the course of the last day. Paul said that he and his father had been eating a late lunch together when they got the call about Roberto. At first, both men had just sat there in shock. Roberto was like part of their family, and they couldn't even come to terms with the fact that he was now gone. But once they heard there had been some sort of explosion and that's what had killed Roberto, they immediately began to blame themselves. Everyone in the company, including Roberto, was diligent about keeping their equipment as safe as possible. So the idea that a faulty electrical box had just killed Roberto just destroyed Paul and his father. But then, earlier that morning, after the ATF and FBI had rolled into town, Paul and his father knew something else was going on. And because of their status in town, they had been able to get information quickly about what appeared to be a criminal investigation, not a query into an industrial accident. Salm and the other detective nodded and said Paul was right. There was no use pretending the Moore family didn't know everything about what was happening on and around their farm at all times. But Salm then followed up and said, well, okay, but why did that prompt you to reach out? Paul looked both detectives in their eyes, and he said as soon as he realized somebody may have killed Roberto, there was only one person who came to mind, and that was his own cousin, Peter. A look came across Salm's face like he'd just heard the most obvious thing ever, and he couldn't believe he hadn't already thought of it. Detective Salm, like almost everyone in town, knew about Peter's bad temper and about his strained relationship with his father and his uncle. Paul said that his cousin Peter had always been a total jerk to Roberto, and just recently, he had even threatened to physically fight Roberto. Paul usually just told himself that his cousin was all talk and that he would never actually do anything to Roberto, but recently, Paul said Peter really seemed more angry than usual at Roberto. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand was shaking as he pulled up text messages between him and his cousin Peter. Paul held out the phone, and the detective working with Psalm took it from him. Then he and Psalm scrolled through a series of text messages that Peter had sent to Paul over the past couple of weeks, and in these texts were a series of very harsh criticisms of Roberto. Peter had messaged Paul to tell him that the rice fields were a total mess and that it was all Roberto's fault, and that Roberto really needed to be fired. There were also text exchanges between the cousins in which Peter talked openly about wanting to physically attack Roberto. After talking a bit longer, the conversation reached its natural conclusion, at which point Paul got up and Psalm thanked him for coming in, and then after Paul had left, Psalm quickly gathered the other members of his team. Peter's very hot-tempered reputation and those text messages they had just seen were enough to immediately make Peter their primary suspect. But there was something else that jumped out to Detective Psalm. The ATF agent that Psalm had met with said he believed whoever planted the bomb that killed Roberto would have to understand how the electrical equipment worked, because the bomb had been connected to the high-voltage system used to start the irrigation pumps. And Detective Psalm knew that Peter had spent the bulk of his life on the family farm, and he had grown up learning every aspect of the business, so he would absolutely know how the electrical equipment worked. So Psalm didn't waste any time. Using the text messages from Paul and evidence the ATF and FBI had found at the crime scene, Psalm secured a warrant to search Peter's house and to conduct around-the-clock surveillance on him. Psalm hoped he could bring this case to a close within a couple of days. On July 19th, so 3 days after the explosion that killed Roberto, Detective Psalm and his team rifled through everything inside of Peter's house. As Psalm led the search, one thing kept coming into his mind, and it wasn't Peter's possible guilt or even the explosion itself. It was the bravery that Roberto's 7-year-old son Fabian had shown. This boy had been just feet away from the explosion. Shards of glass literally had flown at him, and he had seen the horrific sight of fire ravaging his father's body. But this little kid had turned and ran miles to get help. As terrified as he must have been, he had done everything he could to try to save his father. So Psalm told himself that he not only owed it to Roberto to solve this case, he also owed it to Fabian. It was Psalm's job now to do everything he could, just like Fabian had done. Psalm was standing in Peter's home office when a deputy came in to tell him that Peter and his wife had just pulled up in front of the house. Psalm nodded and went to meet them. Peter was already rushing towards the front door when Psalm stepped outside, and Peter started yelling immediately. He wanted to know what the police were doing there, and Psalm told him they had a search warrant, and so Peter knew right away that he had to be a suspect in Roberto's murder. Then Peter did something that took Psalm by complete surprise. Right there in front of his wife and other police officers, Peter launched into a tirade about how arrogant Roberto had been and how he had never liked Roberto. But Peter said that just because he didn't like Roberto, it didn't mean that he, Peter, was a killer. After this exchange, Psalm just nodded and walked back into the house to continue the search, while other officers stayed outside with Peter and his wife. The initial search of Peter's property didn't provide police with a smoking gun or anything like that, but they did confiscate Peter's computers and his cell phone. And when Psalm left the house, he was still convinced Peter was the killer. This guy couldn't even contain his hatred for the victim, while police were actively searching his house. But as investigators began their surveillance of Peter and they continued to search other properties that belonged to Peter, this case would take a baffling turn, and Detective Psalm would soon start to feel like he was living in some kind of Hollywood crime thriller. On the morning of August 12th, almost a month after Roberto's murder, Detective Salm sat down at his desk at the sheriff's department, and when he did, he saw there was an envelope with the words Ayala case written on it. The words had been made with a label maker and then photocopied onto a piece of paper, and the small envelope had 8 stamps on it, way more than were needed to send it in the mail. Salm opened the envelope and took out a letter that was addressed to the investigators. Just like the front of the envelope, the words in the letter had been created with a label maker and then copied. Salm and his team had spent the past few weeks continuing their surveillance on Peter Moore. They still hadn't found any evidence tying Peter directly to the crime scene, but Salm was confident they were getting close. In fact, Peter's uncle had provided Salm with a phone message in which Peter had called, begging his uncle to talk to get Peter's father to put Peter back in his will. After that, Salm had discovered that Peter's father, one of the Moore brothers, had not only cut Peter out of his financial inheritance, but he also had cut Peter completely out of the family business. So Peter wouldn't take over at all when the Moore brothers retired. Instead, Paul would run the company, and Roberto Ayala would be his right-hand man. All of the clues in this case pointed right to Peter, as far as Detective Salm was concerned. But now Salm was staring at this bizarre letter, and he had no idea what to think. The letter was written by a man who claimed to be a hired assassin. The assassin said that he had been paid to take out Roberto by a well-known violent international criminal gang called MS-13. The assassin said that Roberto's brother had tried to rip off members of MS-13 in an international drug deal, and so they had Roberto killed as revenge. But that wasn't all. The assassin said MS-13 wanted him, the assassin, to strike again and kill Roberto's brother and other members of his family next. But this assassin said they had seen the light and did not want to kill anyone anymore, so he was now trying to help the police without giving himself up. Salm put the letter down and just stared off into space for a minute. He was a detective in a small sheriff's department in a small county. This case was already bigger than anything he'd ever dealt with, and now he had this letter from an assassin like a cop would get in some kind of a crazy action movie. None of this made any sense to Salm, and he was at a loss for what to do next. So he reached out to his new contacts in the ATF and the FBI and shared the letter with them. The federal agents agreed with Salm that the letter was very strange, but they didn't want to ignore any possible lead. And so they started to investigate the MS-13 crime group to see if they could find any connection to Roberto, his brother, or anybody else in the county. Then, 2 days later, Detective Salm was back at the station, and he found another envelope with the same kind of label on it as the last one sitting on his desk. And when he opened this envelope, he found a single page with a detailed diagram of the bomb that was supposedly used to kill Roberto. Salm immediately contacted ATF agents, and when they looked at this diagram, they confirmed that it matched the type of homemade bomb they believed had killed Roberto. So whoever sent this diagram, professional assassin or otherwise, definitely had intimate details about the murder weapon. So, over the next week, the investigation shifted focus to MS-13 and the letters Salm had received. Still, Salm never gave up on the idea that Peter Moore had been involved in Roberto's murder in some way. But Salm still could not find clear evidence that could tie Peter to the murder. And investigators also couldn't identify or locate this mysterious assassin who had supposedly sent these letters. So Salm and his team started to lose hope. They had felt kind of overwhelmed from the beginning of this investigation, and now things had gotten so crazy and far-fetched that they couldn't even see how they were going to figure out what had really happened to Roberto. And Salm really felt guilty, like he was letting Fabian and the rest of Roberto's family down. On August 20th, over a week after that first letter arrived, Salm was sitting at his desk. At this point, he almost expected something totally bizarre and straight out of a movie to happen daily in this investigation. And almost on cue, Salm's phone rang. He answered, and he heard a muffled voice on the other end. Salm asked who was calling, but the person wouldn't say who they were. They simply said they had information about Roberto's murder that investigators needed to hear. Then, the caller said one simple thing and hung up. And once again, Detective Salm sat there stunned. This just seemed like more crazy movie stuff to him. But then he felt a jolt of energy. Something the anonymous caller said suddenly made complete sense to Salm. He got up from his desk and called his team together. Then he contacted the federal agents who had been working with them. Salm told them all about this phone call he just got, and then he showed them a piece of evidence that he thought supported what the caller had just said. And everyone on the team thought Salm was definitely onto something. It would take several weeks for investigators to put everything together, but they would eventually figure out what happened to Roberto out on that isolated farm road. Based on the anonymous phone call and evidence discovered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened on the day of Roberto Ayala's murder, July 16, 2011. A flashlight clicked on, but it was still very dark on the secluded farm road. The sun wouldn't come up for a few hours, and the bomber thought there was something eerie about this place in the total darkness, like someone or something could be hiding anywhere out in the rice fields, watching. The bomber shook off those thoughts, though, and followed the beam of light down the road towards the wooden pole with the large metal box attached to it. The bomber wore all black and had a large black bag slung over their shoulder. The bomber walked down the road and eventually reached the pole, at which point they put the bag on the ground. Then they opened up the high-voltage metal box and then crouched down and unzipped their bag. They shined the flashlight into the bag, and they could see the homemade pipe bomb they'd constructed. It hadn't been easy, but everything they had read made them feel confident that this pipe bomb would function the way it was supposed to when the time came. The bomber reached into the bag and slowly and carefully began to set up the pipe bomb inside of the metal box. There was a line that would be pulled when the door to the box was opened and the irrigation switch was flipped, and that line would engage a trigger that would set off the explosives inside of the pipe bomb. As the bomber worked, they could feel sweat dripping down their forehead, but they took a deep breath, kept their hands steady, and finished the job. The bomber closed and locked the door to the metal box and exhaled. Then they walked back down the farm road to their vehicle and drove into the darkness. Now all they had to do was wait. Hours later, at around 1 p.m., Roberto parked his white F-250 truck on the road and told his son Fabian he'd be right back. Roberto stepped out of the truck, and before he began walking down the road, he turned around and glanced back at his truck, and he smiled. He could see Fabian looking back at the sunflower field in the distance. Roberto turned back around and continued walking towards the pole, and as he did, he put on his electrical gloves, and then when he reached the pole, he opened up the door to the high-voltage metal box and flipped the switch to start the irrigation system. The explosion was enormous and instantaneous, and Roberto actually died instantly from electrocution coming out of the box. But as his body fell to the ground, it was wreathed in flames caused by the explosion of the pipe bomb. The ground shook, and in the truck, Fabian was covered in pieces of glass from the shattered windshield and windows, but Fabian remained courageous and leapt out of the truck and ran towards his father, who was literally on fire. Fabian thought about trying to reach through the flames to pull his dad's phone out of his jeans pocket to try to call for help, but the fire was just too much. And so after taking one last look at his dad, the 7-year-old turned and just started running. Later that afternoon, one of the Moore brothers' phones rang. It was the police, and they were telling him what had happened to Roberto. He hung up and he started crying. Then he looked across the table and told his son what he just heard. His son looked stunned. He said there was no way this could be true. But as an outward expression of hurt and confusion came across the son's face, internally, the son felt completely relieved because he knew his homemade pipe bomb had just worked. Paul Moore had killed Roberto, not his cousin Peter, who Paul immediately had thrown under the bus. It would turn out that Paul hated Roberto just as much as Peter did, but Paul did a better job hiding it. And when Peter had lost his inheritance and his chance to someday run the family farm, Paul had begun to fear that his father and uncle could do the same thing to him. And then the Moore brothers had begun to talk about possibly making Roberto a financial partner in the business, and at that point, Paul had just had enough. And so Paul got to work building his pipe bomb. He knew Roberto's irrigation schedule, so he knew exactly when and where to plant the bomb. While he waited for the day to come that he would be able to kill Roberto, Paul began accumulating evidence that would send investigators directly to his cousin Peter. In fact, Paul was the man who had brought ATF and FBI agents the piece of metal found in the canal that made it clear Roberto had been killed with a bomb. But when investigators failed to arrest Peter right away, Paul had decided he would need to throw them even further off of his trail. Paul was the one who had created the letters from the assassin, and he had dreamed up the story about Roberto's brother being connected to MS-13. Paul thought it was a perfect plan, like something right out of a movie. But it was actually the fake assassin letters that eventually got Paul busted. The anonymous caller who contacted Detective Salm told him that he was looking into the wrong cousin. Paul, not Peter, was the guilty party. At first, Salm had thought the anonymous caller was maybe just Peter trying to now throw suspicion on Paul, but then, as Salm thought about it, something from early on in the case came back to him. In the text message exchanges between Peter and Paul often used numbers as abbreviations for words, like using the number 4 in a sentence like, "I have something for you." He would actually put the 4 instead of FOR. And when Salm went back to the letters from the supposed assassin, it turned out the assassin used the same type of abbreviations. And so with this anonymous call, which by the way would stay anonymous, we don't know who called that in, and the connection between Paul's texts and the assassin's letters, Salm and his team searched Paul's home. And tucked away in his office, they found evidence that did link him to the diagram of the bomb that the alleged assassin had sent to the police. And soon after that, police arrested Paul. Paul was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Roberto's son, Fabian, who had so bravely tried to run to save his father on the day he was killed, spearheaded a project to erect a memorial in his father's honor at the elementary school where Roberto had gone as a child. And in 2022, Fabian graduated from high school as a varsity football and soccer star.